The moment the chauffeur, Amir Halim, eased the midnight black Rolls-Royce to a stop at the base of the shimmering Al-Mansoor financial tower, the quiet desert air fractured under the echo of arrogant laughter coming from the back seat. Billionaire magnate Rashid Al-Mansoor, draped in a flawless suit and an even more flawless sense of superiority, had just ended a mocking phone call about a rival's downfall. Without even looking at the man driving him, Rashid leaned forward with a grin sharp enough to cut glass and tossed out a question meant to belittle, not to be answered. "Tell me, Amir, if you were rich like me, how would you fix my company's little financial mess?" It was meant as a joke, one of those cold, careless jokes powerful men tell to remind everyone else of their place. But the moment the words hit the air, the atmosphere inside the car shifted. Amir felt them like a stone dropped into deep water. He wasn't just aware of Rashid's so-called little mess. He had seen the late-night spreadsheets, overheard the panicked calls, noticed the unusual meetings with silent investors whose faces never matched their smiles. Years of quiet observation had taught Amir far more about Rashid's empire than any executive realized. Yet he kept his knowledge buried behind a disciplined silence, the kind only a man living paycheck to paycheck could perfect. Still, tonight, the city lights glinting off the Burj Khalifa seemed to whisper that this moment wasn't random, that Rashid's mockery had accidentally triggered something far larger than humor. When Rashid laughed again and repeated the question, this time slower, as if savoring the humiliation he expected, Amir felt a tremor of fate crawling up his spine. It wasn't anger, not yet, but the unmistakable awareness that if he answered honestly, the hierarchy between them would crack. Something irreversible was about to unfold, something that would pull both men into a chain of events neither could control. Amir tightened his grip on the steering wheel, looked at Rashid through the rearview mirror, and understood that this night would not end the way either of them imagined. The billionaire had opened a door. Without realizing, the man sitting in front of him carried the key. Before that night, Amir Halim lived in the unnoticed corners of Dubai's relentless brilliance, a city where wealth towered over everything, and men like him moved quietly beneath its shadow. Every morning, he woke in a cramped apartment above a small grocery shop in Dera, where the walls hummed with the sound of old pipes, and the future felt like a distant luxury he couldn't afford. He worked 2 jobs, driving for Rashid by day and repairing broken electronics by night, trying to chip away at the medical debt left behind after his mother's long illness. But even in exhaustion, there was a sharp mind behind his tired eyes, a man who read financial reports the way others read gossip, a man who watched market trends the way drivers watched traffic lights. Yet none of that brilliance had a place in the world he occupied. He was a chauffeur, paid to remain invisible, and visibility in a city built on status could be the most unforgivable sin. Still, Amir carried within him a quiet hunger that refused to die. During the long hours waiting outside hotels, private terminals, and glittering gala entrances, he read economics textbooks borrowed from a dusty library, took online courses hidden behind an old phone screen, and practiced analyzing market volatility on scraps of paper left in the glove box. He wasn't learning for fun. He was preparing, without telling anyone, for a life he believed might exist someday beyond the steering wheel. His talent was quiet and constant, like a tide that never stopped rising. Yet to everyone around him, he was simply the man in the crisp uniform who opened doors, carried briefcases, and nodded respectfully while others spoke about millions, as if discussing the weather. No one saw the calculations running behind his thoughtful silence. No one imagined the depth of understanding that lived in a man making barely enough to survive. And despite the heavy weight of unspoken dreams, Amir lived each day with humility, carved from necessity. He never complained, not even when the overtime stretched into dawn, or when Rashid barked impatient orders without lifting his eyes. He accepted each small disrespect with the calm of someone who understood the world's brutal hierarchy too well. But there was a deeper struggle beneath his polite surface, the constant fear that his father's failing repair shop back home in Alexandria would collapse before Amir could rescue it, the fear that he would always be trapped in this unending cycle of service and silence. That fear fueled him, sharpened him, made him study harder and observe more carefully. And though the world saw him as a simple chauffeur, the truth was far more dangerous for men like Rashid. Amir Halim was a man prepared for a chance, any chance, to prove he was far more than the uniform he wore. Rashid Al-Mansoor was not just another wealthy man in Dubai. He was the kind of figure whose presence bent the atmosphere around him, the kind of billionaire whose signature could lift or destroy entire companies before sunrise. Born into power, raised in the private halls where oil dynasties whispered, Rashid had built a reputation as a cold, calculating financial kingpin. He operated with the detached precision of a surgeon, slicing through markets and competitors with an elegance that made boardrooms tremble. People spoke his name with caution, always in low voices, as if saying it too loudly might summon him. Everything about him, the tailored suits, the unreadable eyes, the measured tone that never rose above steady dominance, created a man for whom the world always stepped aside. In public, Rashid appeared unshakable, a pillar of wealth and composure that made investors chase his approval and executives panic at the slightest change in his expression. His empire stretched across real estate, digital banking, and renewable energy, a portfolio so vast and meticulously protected that few imagined it could ever falter. But behind the polished exterior was a man shaped by relentless pressure, raised by a father who demanded perfection and punished weakness with silence sharper than any blade. Rashid had learned early that vulnerability was a luxury only the powerless could afford, so he built walls, high, cold, and ironclad, walls that ensured no one, not even his closest advisors, would ever see fear in his eyes. Those walls isolated him, but they also made him untouchable, and that was the only thing he ever believed he needed. To his employees, Rashid was a storm disguised as stillness. To his board, he was a necessary threat. To strangers, he was a myth carved into the skyline. And to Amir, sitting behind the wheel each day, Rashid was the embodiment of a world that rewarded arrogance and punished humility. Yet despite all the power he wielded, despite the empire he controlled with effortless authority, there was something else lurking beneath the surface, an instability, a tightening coil of pressure that Amir had sensed weeks before anyone else noticed. And on the night Rashid mocked him in the back seat of the Rolls-Royce, that hidden tension was already pressing against the man's carefully constructed facade. Rashid Al-Mansoor, the billionaire feared by nations, had no idea that the chauffeur he tried to humiliate was the one person who had quietly pieced together the cracks in his golden kingdom. The elevator lobby of the Al-Mansoor Financial Tower always smelled faintly of marble polish and expensive cologne, a place where suits glided like predators and security guards stood straighter than soldiers. That night, Rashid stepped out of the Rolls-Royce with the kind of confidence only wealth could breed. But before Amir could even close the door behind him, the billionaire suddenly snapped his fingers, sharp, loud, and unmistakably demeaning. "Amir," he said, not bothering to face him, "come inside. I want everyone to hear your brilliant advice." The sarcasm dripped so thickly it felt like humiliation poured directly onto the polished floors. Amir froze for a moment, unsure if he had misheard. Chauffeurs never entered the tower. They waited outside in the heat, in the cold, in the shadows. That was the rule. But Rashid wanted a show. He wanted an audience. And just like that, Amir knew this was not about business. This was about entertainment, the kind that fed the ego of powerful men. Inside the executive atrium, a handful of late-night analysts and jittery junior managers were huddled over projections glowing across giant screens. Their conversations died instantly when Rashid walked in, and their faces shifted into that familiar blend of fear and reverence. Without warning, the billionaire waved toward Amir as if presenting a circus act. "Gentlemen," Rashid announced, "my chauffeur believes he knows how to fix our liquidity issue, isn't that right?" A few awkward laughs fluttered through the room. Not cruel, but reflexive. People laughing because they feared what would happen if they didn't. Amir felt heat rising to his face, the kind of heat that wasn't embarrassment, but the sting of being forced into a spotlight he had no right to stand under. He wanted to step back, to disappear, but Rashid's eyes locked onto him with an expression that dared him to speak. The billionaire was savoring this. This was humiliation wrapped in velvet, the kind that left no mark but cut deeper than any blade. Then, in front of everyone, Rashid pushed the boundary even further. "Tell them, Amir," he said, crossing his arms. "Go on, enlighten us. How would a man who earns less in a year than we spend on coffee solve a crisis that my entire board struggles with?" The room went silent, an oppressive, suffocating silence. All eyes turned to Amir, some filled with pity, others with confusion, but most with the tense anticipation of people watching a car crash in slow motion. Amir's throat tightened, and his hands trembled just slightly, but he forced them behind his back to hide it. He knew Rashid didn't expect an answer. He expected shame. He expected the chauffeur to shrink, to stutter, to retreat into silence so Rashid could smirk and walk away feeling taller. And for a moment, as the weight of the room pressed against Amir's chest, it seemed that humiliation had achieved exactly what the billionaire wanted, but something inside the chauffeur, something old, something stubborn, resisted the urge to disappear. And though he didn't know it yet, this moment of public belittlement would become the spark that ignited everything that followed. For a long second, Amir stood there in the center of the atrium, surrounded by glowing screens and silent stares, feeling the weight of humiliation pinning him down like a stone on his chest. But then something unexpected happened, something subtle, almost invisible at first. His breathing steadied, his shoulders eased back, and the fear that had been clawing at his ribs began to dissolve, replaced by a calmness he had not planned, had not invited, but somehow desperately needed. He looked at the charts projected on the wall, liquidity flows, risk curves, market volatility forecasts, and suddenly they weren't intimidating. They were familiar. He had studied these patterns 100 times on cracked screens, in parking lots, and in the quiet corners of his small apartment. This wasn't a boardroom battlefield. It was a puzzle he understood better than the men who built it. So when Rashid smirked and said, "Come on, chauffeur, educate us," Amir did something that made half the room blink in disbelief. He stepped closer to the main projection, lifted a hand, and spoke in a steady, low voice that carried across the marble floor. "Your liquidity issue isn't the problem," he said calmly. "It's the symptom. Your short-term asset rotation is out of sync with your debt obligations, and your digital banking expansion is bleeding cash faster than expected because your customer acquisition model is outdated." The words left his mouth with surgical clarity, each one slicing through the tension like a scalpel. The analysts stared, stunned. The junior managers leaned in. Even the screens seemed brighter, as if reacting to the sudden shift in power. No one moved. No one breathed, because the chauffeur was analyzing their financial crisis with the precision of a senior strategist. Rashid's smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second, barely a flicker, but enough for the entire room to feel it. Amir continued, unaware or uncaring of how deeply he had disrupted the hierarchy around him. "The solution," he said, pointing at a chart, with a confidence that did not belong to a man earning minimum wage, "is not to cut spending, but to reroute the incoming capital from your renewable sector. It's stable, growing, underutilized. You're overlooking the safest arm of your empire because the projections look boring compared to your high-risk ventures." His voice never wavered, and as he finished, a wave of shocked silence rolled through the room. The analysts exchanged glances of disbelief. The junior managers stared as if seeing him for the first time. And Rashid stood utterly still, his arrogance momentarily shattered by the impossible truth unfolding before him. His chauffeur, his invisible, insignificant employee, had just revealed a level of understanding no one in that room had dared to expect. A hidden power had surfaced, and once seen, it could never be unseen. The silence, after Amir finished speaking, stretched across the room like a tightening rope, pulling at every face, every breath, every assumption that had been carved into place long before this night. For a brief moment, it seemed as if something revolutionary had happened, something no one dared to articulate. The billionaire had been challenged, not by a rival, not by a board member, not by a high-ranking strategist, but by a man whose name no one bothered to learn. And the worst part for Rashid wasn't that Amir had spoken, it was that he had been right. The charts aligned with his words, the numbers validated his analysis, and the whole room felt the weight of that truth settling over them like dust in a forgotten library. Rashid's jaw tightened, his posture stiffened, and the embarrassment that flickered behind his eyes quickly turned into a colder, sharper emotion. Threat. When power feels threatened, it never admits it. It reacts. With one swift gesture, Rashid dismissed the analysts, who scattered like startled birds, desperate to escape the storm they sensed building. Only Amir remained in the center of the empty atrium, now painfully aware that he had stepped beyond a line that could never be uncrossed. Rashid approached him slowly, each footstep echoing like a countdown. "You forget your place," he said, voice low but cutting, the kind of tone that carried a threat polished through years of authority. Amir tried to speak, to apologize, to explain that he was only answering the question asked, but Rashid raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "A chauffeur," he continued, "does not critique my empire in front of my employees." And with those words, sharp, absolute, unforgiving, Rashid struck the fatal blow. "You are dismissed." Effective immediately. Just like that, the world Amir had built with discipline and patience collapsed beneath him. Amir stood frozen as security escorted him out of the tower, a tower he had entered only once and would never enter again. The humiliation clung to him like dust, each step toward the exit heavier than the last. His job was gone, his income was gone, his fragile hold on survival was gone, and worst of all, he had no time to prepare, no savings to cushion the fall, no backup plan to catch him. As he stepped into the quiet Dubai night, the city lights no longer looked like distant stars. They looked like reminders of the world he could never reach. The Rolls-Royce he had polished with pride drove away without him, its taillights fading into the darkness like the last remnants of stability being pulled from his life. In a single night, Amir had gone from invisible to dangerous, and now to disposable. Yet beneath the crushing weight of loss, something flickered, not hope, not yet, but the faint spark of a destiny that had just begun reshaping itself in the shadows. For 3 days, Amir wandered through Dubai with the quiet ache of a man trying to hide a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. He filled out job applications in cramped internet cafes, made calls that went unanswered, and stared at his dwindling bank balance like a man watching a fuse burn toward an explosion he couldn't stop. Nights were the worst, long, suffocating stretches where sleep refused to come, replaced instead by the relentless replay of Rashid's words echoing in his mind. "You forget your place." Each repetition cut deeper, reminding him how easily years of loyalty could be erased by a single moment of truth spoken at the wrong time. Yet even as despair pressed down on him, Amir couldn't silence the memory of how the analysts had looked at him, not with pity, but with stunned recognition. The humiliation hurt, but the truth lingered. He had seen the problem clearer than the whole room, and somehow that truth refused to die quietly. On the 4th night, as Amir sat alone on the rooftop of his small apartment building, staring at the city lights shimmering across the distant skyline, his old phone vibrated in his hand. He nearly ignored it. Unknown numbers usually meant scams or mistakes, but something in his chest urged him to answer. When he did, the world seemed to slow. A soft, deliberate voice came through the line. "Amir, this is Rashid." The shock hit him like a physical blow. For a heartbeat, he wondered if it was a joke, a hallucination, some cruel replay his exhausted mind had conjured. But the controlled breath, the unmistakable cadence, there was no doubt. The man who had destroyed his life with a single sentence was calling him, not with anger this time, but with something else woven into his voice. Something unfamiliar, something that unsettled Amir more than rage ever could. Before Amir could respond, Rashid continued, his tone lower than usual, carrying a tightness Amir had never heard from him. "I need you to meet me," he said, "tonight, at the tower." The words, though simple, landed like thunder. The tower, the place of his humiliation, the symbol of his fall, was now calling him back. "This is not optional," Rashid added, but beneath the authority there was a subtle fracture, a hint of urgency that didn't belong to a man in control. and for reasons Amir couldn't explain, he felt a shift in the air around him, something that whispered that destiny rarely knocks twice, and when it does, it's never gentle. With his heart pounding and his future uncertain, Amir whispered the only answer a man standing on the edge of fate could give: "I'll be there." And just like that, the path he thought he had lost forever began to unfold once more, dark, unpredictable, and calling him toward a moment that would change everything. The lobby of the Al-Mansoor financial tower felt different when Amir walked in this time, colder, emptier, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Security didn't stop him. They simply nodded and guided him toward the private elevator, their expressions unreadable, their silence heavier than words. As the elevator doors closed, Amir felt the familiar scent of polished steel and cold air conditioning wrap around him. But instead of humiliation, there was a slow, simmering alertness rising inside him. He was no longer just a chauffeur walking into a world that didn't belong to him. He was a man returning to the scene of his downfall, unsure whether he was being summoned for redemption or destruction. When the elevator opened onto the top floor, Rashid stood alone by the panoramic window, the city lights painting sharp angles across his face. He didn't turn. He didn't speak. He simply breathed, slow, controlled, strained. When Rashid finally faced him, his expression was nothing like the arrogant smirk that had once sent Amir spiraling into a nightmare. His jaw was tight, but not with anger. This time it was tension, the kind born from a man who had built an empire only to feel pieces of it slipping through his fingers. "My board has turned against me," he said abruptly, as if ripping open a wound. He didn't ease into it. He didn't soften his tone. He spoke like a man drowning, too proud to admit he needed help, but too desperate to hide it. "The liquidity issue you pointed out, it's worse than they're letting on. They're using it as leverage. They think I'm distracted, weak, replaceable." Rashid's voice cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for Amir to recognize the rarest thing a powerful man could show: panic. "You saw something they didn't," Rashid continued, stepping closer. "You understood what my advisors failed to see." The words that came next were ones Amir never imagined hearing in 2 lifetimes. "I need you." Rashid forced the admission out, each syllable sounding like it scraped against his pride. "Not as a driver, not as an employee, as someone who sees clearly." The billionaire looked away for a moment, as if the confession burned, then added, "If I don't fix this, they will take everything, my company, my legacy, my father's name. I cannot trust my own board. But you—" He hesitated, searching for the right word, the truth he had no choice but to face. "You saw the flaw instantly. I need that clarity now." The room fell silent, except for the distant pulse of the city below, and for the first time, the man who once humiliated Amir stood before him, not as an untouchable titan, but as a powerful figure quietly unraveling, forced to reach out to the one person he had never intended to need. Fate, it seemed, had twisted the world in a way neither man could ignore. For a moment, Amir simply stared at Rashid, unable to reconcile the image before him with the man who had once dismissed him without a second thought. The billionaire's voice, usually sharp and commanding, now carried an unsteady weight, as if every word cost him more pride than he could afford to lose. And though part of Amir felt the old instinct to shrink, to obey, to fold under authority, another part, the part awakened the night he spoke truth in that atrium, refused to return to silence. Slowly, Amir stepped further into the office, the soft glow of the skyline reflecting off the polished floor as he gathered the courage that life had beaten into him through years of struggle, loss, and quiet resilience. "If you're asking for my help," Amir began, his voice steady but carrying the depth of everything he had endured, "it can't be under the same rules. I won't be spoken to the way you spoke to me. I won't be used and discarded again." The words surprised even him, but once spoken, they anchored themselves in the air with undeniable force. Rashid stiffened, not out of anger, but out of the shock of being confronted by someone he had never considered an equal. Amir continued, the confidence in his tone growing not from arrogance, but from necessity. "If I help you, I need transparency, full access to the data, no secrets, no half-truths, and I work on my own terms, not as your driver, not as your subordinate, but as someone whose insight you respect." The statement hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. Amir wasn't bargaining for money or status or revenge. He was asking for dignity, something far more dangerous in the eyes of power. Rashid looked at him, him, truly looked at him, as if seeing the man beneath the uniform for the first time. The realization that Amir was not seeking personal gain, but personal autonomy, seemed to rattle something deep inside him. For the first time in their entire relationship, Rashid didn't speak immediately. He didn't scoff, didn't object, didn't remind Amir of the hierarchy he had once enforced with an iron grip. Instead, he exhaled, slowly, painfully, as if releasing years of rigid pride in a single moment. "You will have access to everything," Rashid said at last, his voice quieter than the night they first met, stripped of grandeur and soaked instead in reluctant sincerity. "And I will respect the boundaries you set." He paused, then added a sentence that marked the true shift in their power dynamic. "If you help me fix this, I will treat you as a partner." The word hit Amir with unexpected force, not because he sought the title, but because a man who once believed him beneath notice was now offering him a seat at a table, carved from wealth, legacy, and fear. And though Amir didn't smile, didn't celebrate, something inside him steadied with new purpose. This wasn't simply a negotiation. This was the moment he stepped out of the shadows, and the moment Rashid realized he could no longer navigate his crumbling empire alone. The following days unfolded like a quiet storm, silent on the surface, but heavy with the force of transformation gathering underneath. Amir stepped into a world he had only witnessed. From the periphery, a realm of glass-walled war rooms, encrypted reports, and sleepless nights spent decoding the financial arteries of a collapsing empire. Rashid granted him full access, just as promised. Sensitive files, confidential audits, hidden ledgers that revealed patterns even more troubling than Amir had imagined. But instead of shrinking under the weight of this responsibility, he rose with a clarity that surprised even him. Each night, Amir returned to his small apartment, surrounded by worn textbooks and cheap instant coffee, studying projections until dawn. His mind moved like a machine honed by hunger and discipline. Day by day, he shed the identity of a man who opened car doors, becoming instead someone who opened vaults of information only elites were ever meant to see. As the transformation deepened, his confidence grew, not the loud, polished confidence of wealthy men, but the quiet, unshakable certainty forged by years of being underestimated. He began dressing differently, not in luxury, but in crisp shirts and fitted jackets bought with money he didn't have to spare, clothes that made him feel like he belonged in boardrooms rather than parking lots. Rashid noticed the change. The employees noticed too. The analysts who had once laughed nervously at his presence now fell into respectful silence when he entered a room, waiting to hear the insights of the man who unraveled their crisis with ease. And though Amir never flaunted his skill, the aura around him shifted, like a dormant blade finally unsheathed. His voice no longer wavered, his posture no longer bent. He walked with the weight of a man stepping into a role destiny had carved from the shadows long before he knew to claim it. Meanwhile, Rashid, who had built his empire on control, found himself relying on Amir's clarity more than he could admit aloud. They spent long nights reviewing projections together, the billionaire pacing anxiously while Amir calmly traced patterns on screens with the precision of a surgeon. Slowly, an unexpected dynamic formed, Rashid's strategic aggression pairing with Amir's analytical depth, creating a balance neither had known they needed. With each breakthrough, the plan to save the empire sharpened into real strategy, clean, powerful, and impossible for the board to ignore. And as Amir's transformation continued, he began to feel something he had long been denied: agency, the right to stand tall, the right to influence outcomes, the right to shape a future no longer dictated by the uniform he once wore. By the end of the week, Dubai felt different. The city's bright skyline, once a reminder of everything he lacked, now shimmered like a horizon he was finally approaching, not as a spectator, but as a contender. The boardroom on the 92nd floor of the Al-Mansoor financial tower had always been a sanctuary for power, gleaming mahogany, panoramic windows overlooking the desert, and a table so polished it reflected every nervous look cast across its surface, but on the morning of the decisive meeting, the air inside felt charged, almost electric, as if the room itself sensed the brewing collision. Rashid entered with a severity that silenced even the most outspoken members, but it was Amir who followed behind him that drew every pair of eyes. Some board members frowned, others whispered, but all of them stiffened with unease. A chauffeur had no place in this arena, yet he walked in with the quiet gravity of someone who had earned a seat, even if no one dared to acknowledge it out loud. And when Rashid gestured for Amir to stand beside him rather than behind, a ripple of shock cut through the room like a blade. The presentation began with icy formalities, numbers flashing across massive screens as executives debated projections with forced confidence. But beneath their polished words, tension simmered. Everyone knew the company was stumbling toward a cliff, and each man at the table was secretly calculating how to survive the fall. Then came the moment they had been dreading, the vote to strip Rashid of his authority, a decision wrapped in polite language but sharpened by ambition. As signatures hovered over digital tablets, Rashid lifted a hand, stopping the process cold. "Before you decide the fate of my leadership," he said, "you will hear the truth." And in that moment, he stepped aside, allowing Amir to take the floor. Gasps escaped the room. A few faces flushed with anger, others with disbelief. But Amir didn't flinch. He approached the screen with calm precision, his posture steady, his expression unreadable. The room fell into a silence so deep it felt sacred. With a single swipe, Amir revealed data the board had never seen, patterns buried under layers of misleading reports, evidence of market misinterpretations, and a blueprint that exposed the real cause of the liquidity crisis. His voice carried with a confidence that did not beg for authority, but commanded it through clarity alone. He broke down the instability with surgical skill, showing how shifting capital from the renewable sector could stabilize the company in weeks, not months. And as he spoke, the board members leaned forward, their hostility sinking beneath the weight of undeniable truth. Here, in the highest room of the tallest tower, a former chauffeur dismantled months of corporate chaos with the ease of someone who had lived his entire life solving problems no one bothered to see. By the time he finished, the silence felt different, not tense, not skeptical, but shaken. Amir had turned the boardroom into an arena, and without raising his voice, he had become the strongest presence within it. Just as the board sat in stunned silence, absorbing the force of Amir's revelations, a slow, deliberate clap broke the stillness. At the far end of the table, half hidden by the massive screens, stood Karim Al-Hadid, the chief financial strategist and Rashid's longest-serving advisor. His expression carried the kind of cold amusement that didn't belong in a moment of salvation, but in a moment of sabotage. "Impressive," Karim said, voice dripping with polished sarcasm. "Truly, but perhaps our guest doesn't realize that financial theory is not the same as running a multi-billion-dollar empire." His gaze narrowed at Amir, not with disdain alone, but with something sharper, fear, disguised as arrogance. For months, Karim had been whispering into the ears of board members, shaping their doubts, feeding the instability that now threatened Rashid's position. And now, seeing Amir strip away their assumptions with clarity he couldn't manipulate, Karim finally saw the one thing he never expected: competition. Before Amir could respond, Karim stepped forward, tapping the screen to pull up a different set of numbers, distorted projections, selectively chosen metrics, and misleading forecasts designed to incite panic. "You're looking at the company through a student's eyes," he said, directing his venom toward Amir. "You understand spreadsheets, not strategy. You analyze data, but you don't understand consequences." His voice carried through the room with the smug confidence of a man who believed he owned the space around him. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to trust the man they had followed for years or the chauffeur, who had just exposed truths none of them saw. Karim sensed the wavering loyalty and pressed harder. "We need leadership, not fantasies, and certainly not from—" He glanced at Amir's modest suit, letting the insult hang, "someone who doesn't belong in this room." The cruelty was elegant, practiced, but beneath the surface there was panic. Karim wasn't just trying to protect the company, he was trying to protect himself. Rashid's jaw clenched, but even he seemed caught off guard. Karim had always been loyal, or so he believed. Now the strategist's mask cracked, revealing the ambition he had hidden behind years years of compliance, and suddenly everything clicked for Amir. The questionable reports, the manipulated projections, the mysterious pressure on Rashid's leadership. Karim wasn't reacting to the crisis. He had been orchestrating it, positioning himself as the savior who would step in once Rashid fell. Amir felt the realization burn through him like a spark hitting dry tinder. This wasn't a simple corporate rivalry. This was a trap meticulously crafted by the very man Rashid trusted most. And now that Amir had disrupted the narrative, Karim needed to discredit him fast, brutally, and publicly. The hidden enemy had stepped into the light, and the boardroom suddenly felt less like an arena and more like a battlefield. As Karim finished his attack, the boardroom buzzed with uncertainty, the kind that slithers through a crowd when truth and lies collide in equal measure. But while the others wrestled with doubt, Amir's mind raced through the numbers Karim had projected. Something felt wrong, not just wrong, but deliberate. The figures didn't match the datasets he had analyzed over the past week. The calculations were oddly rounded, the ratios suspiciously convenient, and then, like a lightning bolt cutting through heavy clouds, Amir saw it. A tiny discrepancy in a long column of numbers, so small and so subtle that it would have been invisible to anyone not obsessively familiar with the company's internal metrics. A repeated anomaly, an error too consistent to be accidental. He stepped closer to the screen, eyes narrowing, heart pounding with the unmistakable sense that he was standing at the edge of a revelation that could burn the entire boardroom to ashes. He zoomed in on the projection, highlighting a single value, one that looked normal at first glance, but betrayed itself under scrutiny. "This figure," Amir said quietly, his voice slicing through the room's rising tension, "has been altered." A wave of murmurs rippled across the table. Karim's smile faltered, just barely, but it was enough to confirm Amir's growing suspicion. He continued, "This same modified value appears across multiple reports delivered only to the board, but in the original raw data." He tapped the screen, pulling up the true number. The discrepancy was undeniable. A small change, but one that cascaded into massive distortions, making the crisis appear far worse than it actually was. "Someone," Amir said, turning slowly toward Karim, "has been doctoring financial forecasts, not to hide losses, but to manufacture them." The room fell into stunned silence. No one moved, no one breathed, because the accusation was not just bold, it was lethal. Karim's mask shattered in an instant. He lunged toward the controls, trying to shut down the projection, but the board members, finally, grasping the scale of the betrayal, rose from their seats in outrage. Amir stepped back, watching the truth ripple across every shocked face in the room. The evidence was irrefutable. Karim had engineered the crisis, manipulated the data, and weaponized fear to undermine Rashid's leadership. "You wanted him removed," Amir said, his voice now steady as stone, "and you used fabricated numbers to force the board's hand." With nowhere left to hide, Karim's composure cracked into fury. "You don't understand what this company needs," he snapped, but the desperation in his voice only confirmed his guilt. The revelation hit Rashid like a blow to the chest. Betrayal from his closest advisor, uncovered by the one man he least expected to rely on. And as the board erupted into chaos, Amir realized he had done more than expose a fraud. He had ripped the mask off the true enemy standing at the heart of the empire. Chaos erupted in the boardroom, voices overlapping, chairs scraping, accusations bouncing off the glass walls. But in the center of it all, Amir remained still, watching Karim with the calm focus of someone who had already solved the puzzle. The strategist was cornered, yes, but men like Karim didn't fall silently. He paced in frantic circles, spewing excuses, drowning the room in technical jargon meant to confuse the board and dilute the truth. It was a last stand built on noise and desperation, and for a moment some members hesitated, because despite everything, Karim had years of influence, years of trust, years of control over this room. But Amir saw the weakness in his defense. Chaos only works when people can't see clearly. So he took a slow breath and stepped forward, not to accuse Karim again, but to let him destroy himself. "Karim," Amir said calmly, "you said these projections were pulled from last quarter's final audit, correct?" The question was simple, too simple, and that's exactly why. Karim didn't see the trap springing under his feet. Karim scoffed, eager to re-establish dominance. "Of course," he snapped. "Anyone who has worked here more than a week would know that." His arrogance filled the room with false confidence, fuel he desperately needed. Amir nodded as if accepting the answer. Then, with deliberate precision, he pulled up the company's digital audit logs on the massive screen. The timestamps glowed brightly, undeniable and absolute. "Then you can explain," Amir said, his voice now carrying the quiet weight of inevitable truth, "why these files were edited 3 days after the final audit was locked." The boardroom froze in an instant, Karim's face drained of color. The board members leaned forward, eyes wide, the evidence flashing across the screen like a verdict from a higher court. And then it happened, the fatal mistake. In his panic, Karim lunged for the controls and shouted, "I had to fix those numbers before anyone saw them." It was raw, it was desperate, and worst of all, it was an admission, the kind criminals whisper to themselves in the privacy of their guilt. But here, he had spoken it out loud, in front of witnesses, in front of his employer, in front of his rivals, and in front of the man who had just outmaneuvered him with perfect precision. A heavy silence dropped over the room, this time not out of shock, but out of recognition. The board members looked at Karim with a mixture of fury and disbelief, realizing the scale of his deception and the depth of the danger he had dragged the company into. Rashid stepped forward, his expression carved from cold steel, the betrayal carved deeper than any financial loss. "You sabotaged my company," he said, voice low and lethal. "You sabotaged me." Karim stumbled backward, cornered by the truth he had spilled with his own hands. Security moved in, and for the first time that morning, the boardroom felt united, no longer confused, no longer manipulated. They had witnessed the trap, the confession, the brilliance with which Amir had dismantled the mastermind behind the crisis. As Karim was escorted out, shouting empty threats, Amir didn't move, didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He simply stood in quiet resolve, the room now fully aware of what he truly was. Not a chauffeur, not an outsider, but the man who had outthought the most dangerous figure in the entire company. As the doors slammed shut behind Karim and the echoes of his desperate protests faded down the hall, the boardroom settled into a profound, almost reverent silence. It wasn't the silence of confusion anymore. It was the silence of realization. For the first time in weeks, the board members looked at Rashid not with doubt, but with clarity. The crisis had not been born from incompetence. It had been engineered by betrayal, and the man who revealed that truth was standing calmly beside the very leader they had nearly voted to overthrow. One by one, the executives rose from their seats, glancing between Rashid and Amir, piecing together the true story behind the company's downfall. By the time they returned to their chairs, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Respect, real, undeniable respect filled the room, and when Rashid cleared his throat to speak, every eye was on him, waiting. Rashid didn't begin with a lecture. He didn't defend himself. He didn't plead for trust. Instead, he stepped forward and placed a hand on Amir's shoulder, a gesture so unexpected that half the board inhaled sharply. "This man," Rashid said, his voice steady and resonant, "just saved all of you, saved this company, saved my father's legacy." His words struck the room with the weight of truth. He continued, "While we argued over projections and pointed fingers, he saw what none of us could see, and he did it without title, authority, or recognition." His next sentence landed like a hammer, shattering the remnants of old hierarchies. "From this moment forward, Amir Halim will serve as my senior financial advisor." Gasps rose around the table, not at the audacity of the promotion, but at the inevitability of it. The man had earned the role not through privilege or pedigree, but through brilliance and courage, and every member of that room knew it. Then came the vote, swift, unanimous, and almost ceremonial. Rashid retained full leadership. Karim's manipulations were formally recorded, and Amir's position, once as fragile as thin glass, solidified into something unbreakable. When the digital signatures flashed "approved," it felt like a seal pressed onto destiny itself. For the first time since the crisis began, Rashid allowed himself a breath of relief, a full, genuine one. He turned to Amir and in a rare, unguarded moment said quietly, "I would have lost everything." Amir met his gaze and replied with equal honesty, "You still can, unless we fix this together." It was not arrogance, it was truth. And Rashid nodded, accepting it not as a challenge, but as a partnership. As they walked out of the boardroom side by side, every executive rose in quiet respect, watching the unlikely alliance that had just rewritten the fate of an empire. The victory was not just Rashid's, it was Amir's, and it echoed through the tower with the force of a storm passing, leaving behind a sky finally clear. The sun was beginning to set over Dubai, casting long streaks of gold across the city as Amir stepped out of the tower, this time not as a chauffeur, not as a man in someone else's shadow, but as a newly appointed senior financial advisor. The warm breeze carried with it a sensation he had not felt in years: breath, freedom, the unfamiliar lightness of possibility. As he walked toward the street where he once waited in silence beside the polished Rolls-Royce, he paused, taking in the skyline that had always seemed reserved for others. Now, for the first time, it felt like a horizon he had earned. Each step home felt different, firmer, steadier, as if he were no longer navigating a city built to overlook him, but one he could finally belong to. The uniform he used to wear seemed like a different lifetime, a different man, a ghost he had quietly laid to rest. When Amir arrived at his modest apartment, the hallway lights flickered as they always did, and the familiar scent of spices from the downstairs shop drifted upward. But tonight, nothing felt small, nothing felt limiting. He placed his worn shoes by the door and looked at the tiny table where he used to study at night, textbooks stacked beside an old lamp that hummed softly. For years, that table had been the center of his quiet hope, the silent witness to his private battle. And now, returning to it as a man transformed, Amir felt a surge of something powerful, gratitude mixed with triumph. He sat down, running his fingers over the textbook's faded covers, and allowed himself a long, deep breath. The world outside finally saw what he had known about himself for years, and despite the new title, the new respect, the new future unfolding ahead, he promised himself one thing: he would never forget where he came from, or the man he had once been. In this room, across the city, Rashid paced inside his office, replaying the day's events. He had walked into the boardroom prepared to fall, and walked out still standing, stronger than he had been in years, and the man responsible for that was now sitting in a small apartment halfway across Dubai. Rashid knew that fortunes could be rebuilt, investments restored, reputations repaired, but trust could not be manufactured. It had to be earned, and Amir had earned his in a way that no number, chart, or contract ever could. As twilight settled over the desert, Rashid made a silent resolution. This partnership would reshape not only the company, but the man he was becoming. For the first time, he wasn't climbing alone. Later that evening, Rashid found himself unable to remain in his office. The adrenaline from the boardroom had long faded, leaving behind a quiet tremor he could no longer ignore. He stared at the portrait of his father hanging on the wall, stern eyes, rigid posture, a man whose approval had always been a currency Rashid never quite earned. For years, he had built his empire under the weight of that gaze, replicating the harshness he had been raised with because he believed it was the only way to survive. But today, standing on the edge of losing everything, he had witnessed something his father had never taught: humility. And it came from the very man Rashid once considered beneath acknowledgement. With a heaviness he rarely allowed himself to feel, Rashid walked out of the tower and headed into the city, searching for the one person he owed more than an apology. He arrived at Amir's apartment with no entourage, no car, no symbols of status, only a deep, unshielded honesty that felt foreign on his tongue. When Amir opened the door, surprise flickered across his face, but Rashid raised a hand, silently asking for a chance to speak before the moment escaped him. "I need you to understand something," Rashid began, his voice stripped of its usual iron. "I didn't didn't fire you because you embarrassed me. I fired you because you reminded me of myself, of the man I used to be before all of this. Hardened me, he gestured vaguely, as if trying to point to the years of pressure, responsibility, and inherited expectation that had sculpted him into a man who mistook cruelty for strength. My father believed that compassion was weakness, Rashid continued, staring at the floor. He taught me to lead with fear, not respect, and I carried that into every decision I made, including how I treated you. The confession hung in the small apartment, heavier than any financial crisis they had faced together. Amir didn't interrupt. He simply listened, recognizing the rare vulnerability in a man who had spent his entire life locked behind armor. Rashid finally met his gaze and spoke the truth that had been buried beneath years of silence. You didn't just save my company today. You saved me from becoming the man I feared I already was. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't justification. It was the kind of raw admission only spoken when a person realizes that their greatest enemy had always been the version of themselves they refused to confront. For the first time, Rashid wasn't the billionaire, the leader, or the untouchable force. He was simply a man trying to make peace with the humanity he had long neglected. And in that moment, Amir understood that the real transformation happening wasn't just his own, it was Rashid's. Amir listened to Rashid's confession with a quiet steadiness, the kind that comes not from superiority, but from understanding the weight of another man's burden. For a long moment, the room felt suspended between past and future, between the man Rashid had been shaped into and the man he was finally allowing himself to become. When silence settled, Amir stepped back, letting the emotions cool before he spoke. I'll help you rebuild, he said softly, but not just the company. He looked directly at Rashid, his tone firm yet compassionate. If we're going to move forward, something has to change. Not just in the numbers, not just in leadership, but in how the people under you are treated. The request was not for himself. It was for every employee who had ever lived under pressure, for every voice stifled by fear. This was Amir's condition, not for profit, not for power, but for dignity. Rashid absorbed the words, his gaze drifting toward the open doorway as if he needed the night air to steady the weight of the moment. You want reforms, he said quietly, not in resistance, but in recognition. Amir nodded. Fair wages, transparent promotion paths, mental health support, and a workplace where people can speak without fearing they'll be crushed for having ideas. He wasn't demanding charity. He was demanding evolution, the kind that would reshape not only the company, but the culture that had allowed a man like Karim to thrive in secrecy. Rashid's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with the gravity of responsibility settling into place. These weren't small changes. They were shifts that would ripple through the entire empire. And yet, looking at the man who had saved everything he held dear, Rashid understood that this wasn't a condition. It was a necessary transformation he should have made long ago. Finally, Rashid exhaled, a deep, grounding breath that seemed to release years of rigidity from his shoulders. Then we'll do it, he said. All of it. He didn't negotiate. He didn't diminish the request. He accepted it fully, as a promise to himself as much as to Amir. If this company rises again, and it will rise built on respect, not fear. The words felt heavier than any financial agreement, because for the first time Rashid wasn't thinking about reputation or legacy. He was thinking about people, about responsibility, about the kind of leader he wanted to become. Amir gave a small nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement, of a pact sealed not by signatures or contracts, but by shared understanding. And in that moment, the rebuilding of an empire began not with money or strategy, but with integrity. In the weeks that followed, the Al-Mansoor empire began to shift, not through sudden miracles or dramatic public announcements, but through quiet, deliberate changes that spread like dawn across the company. Employees noticed first. Supervisors who once barked orders now paused to listen. Meetings that once felt suffocating became spaces where ideas were welcome, and departments previously drained by pressure found new energy and transparency and trust. It didn't happen overnight, but the transformation was real, steady, and unmistakable. In the center of it all was Rashid, no longer leading from a height carved out of fear, but walking among his people with a sincerity that surprised even himself. And beside him, often behind the scenes, was Amir, guiding decisions with the same calm clarity that had saved the company in its darkest moment. The man who once drove the car now helped steer the future. Life outside the tower changed too. Amir moved his family to a better home, paid off his debts, and began restoring his father's small repair shop back in Alexandria, turning it into a symbol of resilience rather than burden. But despite the new salary, the new title, the respect he had earned, Amir never allowed success to wrap him in arrogance. He still walked through Dubai at night with the same quiet appreciation he once felt sitting behind the wheel, still carried himself with humility born from struggle. What changed was how the world looked back at him. No longer invisible, no longer overlooked, no longer underestimated. He had become a reminder that brilliance can come from the most unexpected places, and that a single moment of courage can rewrite an entire destiny. And as the tower lights glittered against the desert sky, one calm evening, Rashid stepped into his office and looked out over the city with a rare softness in his eyes. "Funny," he said, quietly glancing at Amir as they reviewed the last report of the night. "How a joke I made to belittle you became the moment that saved my life." Amir smiled, not with triumph, but with understanding. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about a fall and a rise. It was a story about perspective, about the danger of dismissing the people who stand quietly beside us, about how greatness often hides behind humility, waiting for a single chance to be seen. And so, as the scene fades, one question remains for anyone listening. How many people in your life might be carrying a brilliance you've never taken the time to notice?